صل على محمد
आवाज बुलंद सलवात
صل على محمد
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المطهرين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة يا غريب يا مأمون يا عطشان كربلاء ما خاب من تمسك بكلامنا من لجأ إليكم سادتي يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه وقوله الحق ولا استقل القائمين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ذلك ومن يعظم شعائر الله فإنها من تقوى القلوب. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صدق الله. This is after the epic martyrdom by Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib on the 10th of Muharram on the plains of Karbala. As the family of Imam Hussein alayhi salam departed that sacred city, Imam Ali ibn Hussein Zayd al-Abidin for the first time saw the severed and dismembered body of his father, Sayyid al-Shuhada. And in what state? A body without head, a body with its limbs literally detached from it, a body that had been trampled by the horses, imprinted into that sacred land. And when Lady Zainab alayhi salam, she saw her nephew in that state of intense grief, she recited these lines in order to offer some solace to Ali ibn Hussein. She states, يا ابن رسول الله وينسبون لهذا الطرف ألما لأبرأ بك سيد الشهداء. She states, O son of my brother, O grandson of the messenger of God, I know you are in pain, and I know that you are hurting at this moment. But know at the same time, this land will undoubtedly be only known for it being the location of the grave of your father, the king of martyrs. And then she continues, alayhi salam, and she states that generations after generations, there are going to be people who are going to seek toward removing this epic message of your father from the memory of the masses, but they will be unable to do so. فَلَا يَزْدَادَ أَثَرُهُ إِلَّا أُلُوًّا. Until Lady Zainab alayhi salam, she states, and know that no matter how many movements there are in order to eradicate the teachings of your father and this epic day of Ashura, the only thing that will happen is that this message of your father and Sayyid alayhi salam will only become more grand. Lady Zainab alayhi salam, this days after the day of Ashura, as the caravan of Al-Hussein left Karbala to go to Kufa, foreshadowing and offering solace to Imam Ali ibn Hussein. We fast forward however many years till this day. And like we know that those words of Lady Zainab alayhi salam were endowed with truth. Because everything that she spoke has manifested itself year after year, generation after generation, no matter the time, no matter the age, no matter the circumstance. Al-Hussein alayhi salam remains Karbala. And the day of Ashura, well, there's no day like your day, Allah. And it's important at the same time, my friends, that when we reflect upon this report from Lady Zainab, peace and blessings be upon her, that we realize that we have to play a role in illuminating those words that she spoke on that day. She made a commitment to Imam Ali Zayn al-Abidin, saying that this message of your father, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, will only become more grand year after year, generation after generation, day after day, in spite of every movement that seeks toward eradicating his message. And like we know, during the time of the Umayyads, during the time of the Abbasids, and even in contemporary times, there have been people after people, group after group, who have sought toward removing, for instance, the ziyarah of Al-Hussein alayhi salam. Today, with relative ease, we gather anywhere in this country or in this part of the world in order to commemorate the tragedy of Sayyid al-Shuhada al-Hussein. But like we know, in countries where our ancestors come from, it's not so easy. They have to do it in secret. They had to do it in spite of all of the difficult circumstances that they had to endure and had to encounter. But nonetheless, Zainab alayhi salam, she states, لا يزداد أثره إلا عمي. No, that this message is only going to become greater and more grand and more magnificent. I ask you, my friends, on this eve, first of Muharram, did we not have a role to play in supporting Zainab alayhi salatu wasalam, in also allowing for the enlivening of this message of Sayyid al-Shuhada al-Hussein alayhi salam? At the very least, with our freedom and with every possibility and the privileges that we're afforded, we should undoubtedly be making and performing every single movement in order to also allow for this light of Imam al-Hussein, peace and blessings be upon him, toward manifesting and toward illuminating toward all of those around us at any given day and at any given moment. Which is why for today's discussion, inshallah ta'ala, I want to reflect upon this notion of the globalization of Ashura. And I want to speak to this topic on three different dimensions. The first dimension is toward defining or understanding globalization in light of our communities today. Secondly, to study the impact of globalization on our Majalis ceremonies in honor of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. And the third dimension of this discussion, toward discussing the future of our gatherings in honor of Sayyid al-Shuhada alayhi salam, in light of the globalized world that we are looking at. So let's jump right into the first dimension of our discussion for this evening. And that is to define what exactly is globalization and how does that impact our social and religious communities today. First of all, there's perhaps not a lot more words as popular over the last 15 years in comparison toward globalization. What exactly does it mean? The first image that comes to our mind are these images around this global village, or the fact that the world is consistently getting smaller. With an increase in technology, with a certain ease and access in visiting different parts of the world is undoubtedly becoming a smaller place. Of course, not physically, but metaphorically speaking. That today I can open up my phone and FaceTime my relative in the opposite side of the world. When maybe 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was something unimaginable. That the ease of travel and the distribution of wealth, particularly in this part of the world, affords us certain privileges that perhaps our parents could have never dreamt of. And all of this is allowing, again, for this world of ours to become a lot smaller, and for many, for life to become a bit easier as well. Similarly, the impacts of globalization on society more broadly allow and afford a whole host of benefits. For instance, the ability for our communities to become closer together towards solving real life world problems. How many of you have ever heard of crowdfunding? All it takes is one link that you share to a bunch of people all across the world, and they can donate via their credit cards, no matter where they are in the world, with the hope and with the aspiration of curing the financial difficulties or trials of a given people or of a given community. Globalization in and of itself has allowed for so much real life benefit on a tangible day-to-day basis. But at the same time, this increase or this rise in technology also has cons associated and acclimated with that. With an increase in technology, we spend more time looking down than looking up at the sky. With an increase in technology, we have access to so much information, yet so few people actually read. It's so much easier to read a Wikipedia article and get a summary of a context of any particular subject, and anyone and everyone pretends to be an expert on that subject on the basis of a little bit of that which they read. And we see that globalization and technology in and of itself continues to impact the way that we learn, continues to impact the way that we study. We know that the rise of ChatGPT has created an opportunity for young people to write college essays without really studying the material at all. Well, how is that going to lead to the future of our member or to the future of our doctors? At the end of the day, for all of the good, there's also a lot of bad connected and associated with it. When it comes toward the impact of globalization, when it comes to our religious communities, more specifically, we see that even more so post-COVID, when we have access to so much information, and at the same time a live stream to every single religious program that we put out, it leads to a detriment in terms of the numbers who might show up to some of our majlis. And while the benefit is that so many people can be impacted or can be influenced or can benefit from the majlis, those who have the physical ability to attend, well, they won't attend. Which is why you see the numbers of churchgoers in the US, where they actually collect data, being on the stark decrease on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis. Why? Because if the program is online, why should I show up? And that's only one step away from, well, why do I need to tune in anyway? Sunday is a day for brunch, right? Why would we want to spend time going to church? And the same exact reality impacts us in terms of our religious communities as well. In that famous hadith from Imam Jaffer bin Muhammad, he tells one of his companions, he states, Inni la'uhibbu hadhihi majalis. He goes to his companion, he says, do you guys gather and do you remember us? He says, of course, Ya Ibn Rasulullah. He says, what do you remember of us? He says, we remember your hadith. We study your sciences. We dedicate ourselves toward learning that which you have taught us. And we gather together amongst ourselves and we discuss that. And the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam states, surely I love gatherings like this one. The Arabic language, the word majlis,
comes from the root word jalasa, which literally means to sit. And Majlis is a place where people sit and gather. And Majlis is not when you're sitting on your couch and watching someone else sitting and lecturing. It means when we are in physical association with one another, that's the benefit and the beauty of gatherings like this. So when it comes toward globalization, more generally speaking, we see that there are a whole host of real benefits, but at the same time, there are very stark detriments as well. And there are two, if you go ahead and study many academic journals that actually reflect and research the impact of globalization on religious communities, there are two particular effects of globalization that have manifested themselves over the last 15 to 20 years. The first one of them is positive, and the other one might be positive as well, depending on how you look at it. The first one of the impacts of globalization is that there's a whole lot more religious tolerance in the world with an increase in technology. Let me give you an example. Today, with the ability for me to travel to any part of the world, I'm exposed to that much more diversity. When I'm exposed to different types of people, you generally become a better person as well. When you see more, you experience more, you talk to more, you learn from more, all of those biases that we may have about other individuals, no longer they're present because we can connect with people on a really human level. And so decades after decades, where within certain families, within certain tribal cultures, within certain communities, the only thing that they did was speak poorly about another faith, about another sect, about another ethnicity. All of that changes the minute that we're able to interact with people with different things. So the first benefit or the first impact of globalization on religious communities specifically is the fact that we have become a more tolerant people. And the second one of these impacts of globalization on religious communities is because we are so busy engaging technology on a day-to-day basis, many people, they feel really empty in their hearts. And they're consistently looking for something spiritual. In fact, when we talk about the most popular words in the last 15 years, there's globalization, and undoubtedly there is spirituality as well. And in fact, in accordance with the study in 2020, it suggests that 33% of Americans, they do not identify with any religious group. They don't consider themselves Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or anything else, but rather they consider themselves spiritual, but not religious. How many of you have heard this particular phrase before? And increasingly, it is suggested by the year 2050, more than 50% of individuals, of Americans in this country, they will not identify with any particular faith group, but rather they will identify as spiritual, but not religious. Why this increase in terms of a focus on spirituality, whatever that means? It suffices that people find a sense of voidness in their hearts. Post-COVID pandemic, that which was most Googled online was God, religion, and questions pertaining to the existence of God. People are looking for something. They're looking for something in a world where we are bound by so many distractions. And it's important for us to keep up with the time and recognize these obstacles and challenges within our own communities as well. And that's what then brings me to the second dimension of our discussion. And that is specifically with regards to the impact of globalization in terms of our majalis for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And there are two that I want to speak to. But before that, it's important for us to realize that at the end of the day, no matter how distant we may want to be from it, that our majalis for Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they are the face of Shiaism in the world today. You Google Shia Islam, hit images, or go through all of the websites. And what do you see? Other than that which draws us toward our gatherings across the world for Sayyid Shahada, go on YouTube and do the same. Go search in academic journals and academic encyclopedias online, and you will see that decades upon decades, Western academics have sought only to study Ashura rituals as opposed to any other subject. While that might be increasing in the last 15 or 20 years toward other sciences, within jurisprudence, within Islamic ethics, within Quranic studies, at the end of the day, people have sought to understand what drives people to the way that we are driven when it comes toward our commemoration gatherings for Imam Hussein, alayhi salatu wasalam. And it's important to keep in mind these two important principles. Number one, when it comes toward the impact of globalization on our majalis, it's important for us to reflect upon the history of these majlis and Muslims. I want you to keep in mind that without a doubt, that the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, they gathered together their Shia in order to enliven the tragedy of Hussein alayhi salam. And perhaps the most important outcome of these gatherings was to draw people to tears and toward this emotional element where we recollect that which took place toward the Imam, which is why we see poets that were employed by the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, individuals like De'bal al-Khuzai, Humayd ibn Zayd al-Asadi, and other giants within our tradition who were encouraged by the ahadith of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt to read and to recite and to drive people to emotion and to tears and commemorations. If we rewind the last 250 years of our majalis, we find that many people, they would come to gatherings like this one solely for blessing. It was an opportunity for spiritual rejuvenation. Again, in life where we're busy with everything that we're busy with, people, they just sought to come to a place where they could see their friends, where they could socialize, and hopefully attain some sort of benefit and have their hearts cleansed by weeping for Imam Hussein. In other parts of the world, these majalis took on a very polemical route, meaning that as a minority Muslim denomination, as we are, many questions would often come about. How can you prove, for instance, the imamate of Ali ibn Abi Talib, salamullah alayhi?
نعرة حيدري
محمد وآل محمد صلوات
Polemical questions like the imamate of Ali alayhi salam, the mushaf of Fatima, the differences in the times of our prayers, the difference in the time that we break our fast, our commemorations for Imam Hussein, so on and so forth. All of these questions people were posed and they needed answers to these questions. So in many parts of the world, you would find that the Majlis was solely polemical in order to defend our theology and the response of others. Now, with regards to these two components, which are historical undoubtedly, in light of their socio-political climate, the grieving for Imam Hussein solely this emotional element, or number two, the sole polemical sort of purpose of these majalis, you see that many people have imported these two primary reasons toward this part. The only type of majalis that you see is to compel people to grieve or toward responding toward polemical questions, often in the ways. A second important realization that needs to take place when it comes toward this notion of globalization and its impact on our majalis is our rituals. Rituals undoubtedly serve an incredibly important role within our religious tradition. But again, we live in a world that is very new. Today, anyone can turn on this majlis. Doesn't matter if you're Shia or if you're Sunni, if you're Muslim or if you're not Muslim. And the idea is that we need to adapt to the time that we are living in. The minute that someone sees or searches or researches Shia tradition, again, we know exactly what it is that they're exposed to. And so the big question that we need to reflect upon is whether or not we are truly understanding globalization in terms of how it impacts our religious communities and specifically our majalis for Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam. And this brings me then toward the third dimension of our discussion. And that's how exactly should we be thinking about the contemporary climate in light of all of this realities that we are experiencing socially. Firstly, my friends, it's important for us to identify obstacles and challenges that we encounter or that we endure when it comes towards our efforts. If you go all across the world, or if you even survey most of our communities in this part of the world, you'll likely find that for many young people, or for many people more broadly, that they see most of our gatherings or most of the majalis that is delivered from a minbar like this one as probably very out of touch. That the speaker has no idea what the people are actually going. Or number two, that they are very limited in terms of the scope, meaning that either they are solely focused on this emotional aspect, or the only thing that they do is engage polemics or matters of theology that again everyone has access to or that is heard time and time again. If we want to truly adapt to the time and realize that we have the potential and the capacity to support Lady Zainab alayhi salam in that report that I began, وَلَا يَزْدَادْ أَثَرُهُ إِلَّا عُلُوًا, that this message of Hussein alayhi salam is only going to become more grand, then we have to undoubtedly understand the socio-political, globalized context of the world that we live in. And that means that we need to invest our time and our space and our money and our wealth and our resources and everything at our disposal toward adapting toward the climate that we are in. Let me explain to you what I mean. In Islamic law, we have two different types of rituals. The first one of these rituals are those which are clearly defined. And the second are those which are not clearly defined. The community or society or what is known as urf defines how exactly to perform that ritual. Now follow along with me for just a moment. The type of ritual that is clearly defined is that which has been taught to us by the Prophet, by the Quran, by the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, and there is no negotiating. We have to pray 5 times a day. Someone says, for instance, I don't mind praying 5 times a day, but I feel better, for instance, when I do yoga, or when I meditate, or when I go out for a walk. Good. Do yoga, and go and meditate, and go out for a walk, but that does not mean you can't fulfill your prayer in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed. That means that you have to stand, and that you have to bow, and that you have to prostrate, and there's no negotiating. Someone says, I love to perform tawaf around the Holy Kaaba. So why do I only have to do it 7 times? I want to make it 8 times. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this is a ritual that's clearly defined. Allah Azza wa Jal says 7, so it's 7. There's no negotiating. Someone says, I don't mind fasting. Why can't I fast on the day of Eid al-Fitr? Let me just fast the 29 or 30 days. I don't want to fast one more. Well, you don't have that right. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, fast every day with the exception of these 2 days, and it's my rule, and it's my rule, and there's no way to negotiate. There are certain laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly defined, and there is no negotiating them at all. A second type of law, when it comes toward Islamic jurisprudence, are those rituals that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, and He has explained or commanded us toward performing them, but He doesn't give us specific details in terms of how we do that. Let me give you an example. Allah Azza wa Jal tells us within the Holy Quran that the Sharia commands us, for instance, to be virtuous to our parents. But if you go from culture to culture, community to community, People respect their parents very differently. Some cultures, when their parents walk into the room, they stand up. When you greet your parents, some kiss them on the cheek, some kiss them on the forehead, some kiss them on their hand. There's a different way of respecting on the basis of your culture, on the basis of your community, on the basis of where you live. You can't go to someone in a different part of the world and say, hey, why are you not kissing your mom on the cheek? Why are you kissing her on the forehead? You're not respecting your parents appropriately. You can't do that because that's the way that they may, for instance, respect their parents. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us, for instance, to honoring our neighbor. In some parts of the world, honoring the neighbor means going and greeting them every single day, or making them food and delivering it once a week. Over here, in this part of the world, we might not even know our neighbor's name. But at the very least, honoring our neighbor means that if they ask you for some support, you undoubtedly reciprocate. Or you say hello to them. You wave to them. You ask them how they're doing. You ask them that if they're going on vacation, can I get your mail? Can I grab your packages for you? Whatever. You get the point. There are some rituals within Islamic law that are not clearly defined, but communal custom, they determine how exactly to appropriate that particular ritual. Everyone following what I'm saying? When it comes to the commemoration of the tragedy of Al-Husayn ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, it's one of those acts of worship where undoubtedly it is beloved to Allah and to His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But that being said, it's not been ever clearly defined in terms of how we grieve over Imam al-Husayn. In some parts of the world, they serve lentils on the day of Ashura. And in other parts of the world, they serve meat on the day of Ashura. And in some cultures, they say, why are they serving meat in honor of Imam al-Husayn? We don't eat meat on the day of Ashura. They say, no, we serve the most expensive food in honor of al-Husayn. While others say, we serve the most basic of food, also in honor of Imam Hussein. Love is love. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the ultimate goal is the same, to honor al-Hussein alayhi salam. In many of our Eastern cultures, we wear black in order to commemorate the loss of a loved one. In order to commemorate a tragedy like this tragedy of Sayyid al-Shuhada. While others say no. If someone comes and says, when I grieve, I wear red, or when I grieve, I wear white, does anyone have a right to tell them, don't wear white or don't wear red? No, we don't have that right. Because at the end of the day, that's their show of grief for Imam al-Husayn. In this part of the world, when someone is commemorating a tragedy, they have a moment of silence, or they hold a flower, or they hold a candle, for instance, in honor of the loss of their loved one. That is their show and their culture and their demonstration of grieving over a particular tragedy. And here, sisters and brothers, I say all of this in order for us to understand, once again, the globalized context and the future of our Majlis and our ritual for Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. Does it need to evolve? Does it need to adapt? Do we need to recognize the sacredness of this minbar, but at the same time, the sacredness of everyone watching it as well? But they're not important. Are these gatherings only for our own communities? Are these majlis only meant to be kept within our four walls? I once met this member of my community in New York, and he had converted to the religion of Islam. And after knowing him for many, many years, I told him, my brother, tell me, what brought you toward Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam? And you know what he told me? He said, Sheikh, he says, I love you, and I respect you, and you're my friend. But let me tell you that I was brought toward this love of Muhammad and wa ali Muhammad by people unlike yourself. What did I do? He says, people like you just believe that the Majlis of Al-Husayn alayhi salam, that Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam are only for you. And he said these words. He says, you hold the Imams of Ahlul Bayt hostage from us. So what happened? He says, when I converted to the religion of Islam, he said, I came to a Shia masjid. And I asked them for some resources, and they said, you have the wrong place. We don't have any support for you. Or they looked at me because of the color of my skin. And they thought that I was looking for money. They thought that I was looking for a job. They thought that I was looking for something. But the only thing that I saw was God. I walked into another masjid, and they took care of me, and they treated me well, and they fed me, and they gave me a job, and they gave me books. And in every one of these books, I would see that do not associate yourself with the Rawafid, the Shia. So I began to ask them, who are these people? He said, because of how negative that they were about Shia Muslims, it sparked my curiosity to actually go and do more research. I went to Shia Masjid after Shia Masjid, only to realize that no one was there to help. I went online, and I went to libraries, and I read up on my own, and once I understood the beauty of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, I said, this is undoubtedly the path. My friends, think about it. This message of Al-Hussein alayhi salam is so great. And the themes that we reflect on these nights and days are incomparable to anything else. Love and patience and sacrifice and beauty and altruism and generosity and every other of the most sublime, perfect qualities and manifestations illuminated on the day of Ashura by Hussein ibn Ali.
और मोहम्मद वाले मोहम्मद नारे सलवात
So why shouldn't these realities be exposed toward the hearts of those of us? Keep it to ourselves, and we do what we continue to do without any care, without any contemplation. Those external to these walls, my friends, we're not enlivening the message and the commitment and the promise that Zainab alayhi salam gives to Imam Ali ibn Hussein. Sallallahu alayhi wa. My friends, tonight is likely the night of the first of Muharram. A night when we gather in these gatherings and our heart melts with grief over the tragedy of the son of the daughter of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I want to just leave you with one tradition tonight, and we'll continue to build as we get closer and closer toward the day of Ashura. It is stated that one day when Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam was returning back to Kufa after the Battle of Siffin, he crosses by the land known as Medina. And he looks behind and he screams out this line. He states, Sabran ya Aba Abdullah. He states, be patient, O Aba Abdullah. At that moment, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, his eyes began to become overwhelmed with tears. And he calls out again, Isbir ya Aba Abdullah. Be patient, O Hussein. At that moment, some of the companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen, they say, Oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, why are you telling us the same to be patient? He says, this land is known as Nineveh. This is the land at the bank of the river Euphrates. He says that one day, many years ago, I was in the company of the Messenger of God. And I entered into his home and I saw him sitting on the floor and he was weeping to the extent that his beard was drenched in his own tears. And I said, O Messenger of God, why do you cry? Who has hurt you that you weep in this way? To which Rasulullah, he lifts his head and he looks to Amir al-Mu'mineen and he says, Oh my brother Ali, he says, Jibreel has just entered upon me. And he has said, Oh Rasulullah, I am here to tell you about the martyrdom of your son. He says, what do you mean? He says that on the 10th of Muharram, many years from now, that your son Hussein alayhi salam will be killed at the bank of the river Euphrates, and he will die lonely, and he will die tired, and he will die thirsty. At that moment, Rasulullah says that when Jibreel foreshadowed this for me, I began to cry, and then Jibreel said, "Oh Rasulullah, do you wish to see and do you wish to smell that sand which your son will be butchered upon?" He says, "Yes, O Jibreel." At that moment, Jibreel gave him a little bit of the sand of Karbala, and he lifts it to his nose, and he smells it, and he states, "Ah, Ya Aba Abdullah." At this moment, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, "Oh Rasulullah, and what is going to happen?" At that moment, Rasulullah begins to narrate to him details of that which is going to transpire on the day of Ashura. But I leave you with this on this first night, my friends, that they were told of what was going to happen, what might happen to Imam al-Hussein several decades later. And the messenger of God, the greatest of God's creation, was moved to this many tears. Imagine when they told Hussein's mother Fatima what was going to happen to Aba Abdullah. Or better yet, or greater yet, my friends, imagine what Zainab had to experience when she was standing on that hill, watching with her two eyes everything that Sayyid al-Shuhada al-Hussein had to experience on those last moments of his life on the 10th of Muharram.
We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to breathe in our hearts and tears in our eyes. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fill our hearts with the love of Muhammad wa alihi, to grant us a life that resembles the life of Muhammad wa alihi, and a death that resembles the death of Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the ability to carry this message of Hussein and his grandfather Rasulullah to the world. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for us to be amongst those who manifest these words of faith upon it. So we ask Allah to grant us the ziyarah of Hussein in his life, ورحم الله من قرأ سورة مباركة الفاتحة وبefore that الصلوات على
اللهم صل على محمد.